All right, committee, if you'll go ahead and find a seat, we'll get started here. And Andrew, we are good to go when you are. Excellent. Welcome to K-12 Education Budget Committee. We have a full agenda today. If you notice on our schedule today, it says discussion and action on the Kansas State Department of Education budget. It also says possible action of bills previously heard. I'd like to ask our reviser, Nick, to give a very brief review or explanation of House Bill 2119. Thank you. And Roger, if you could provide that bill for anyone that may not have it with them, just slip your hand up while Nick's talking, and Roger will bring you House Bill 2119.
Certainly, Madam Chair. Committee, House Bill 2119 would create the Student Empowerment Program. This program would authorize parents and guardians of eligible students to establish student savings accounts in the state treasury and to use those accounts for certain educational expenses. As you know, there's certain qualifiers in the bill for students to become eligible. And there's it establishes notification procedures for students who do become eligible, how to establish an account, the monies that go into an account, and everything of that nature. And if you remember as well, there was an extension of a sunset date to the high density at risk weighting for fiscal year 22, I believe. And Madam Chair, that's a very brief overview, but I would be happy to answer questions or go further.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Nick. So House Bill 2119 was reassigned to our committee. So committee, I will now ask you, what is the will of the committee in regard to House Bill 2119? Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would move that we pass out House Bill 2119 favorable.
And second from Representative Johnson. And now open for discussion. Representative Landwehr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this time here, I would like to amend in the education tax credit as we proposed in the committee earlier this year.
And that would be House Bill 2068, I believe. And would anyone from the committee like House Bill 2068? Okay, just raise your hand and Roger will bring that. Is there a second? Representative Penn seconds the motion. All right, discussion on House Bill 2068 being amended into the bill. No discussion, or do you want a minute? Okay. Okay, there is a question, Representative Hoy, and then Representative Byers.
I do not. I was going to make comment. Is that okay, or is this time for questions?
Yes, you can make a comment.
Okay. On both HB 2068 and 2119, I have previously shared concerns. One of them takes public funding and diverts it into private schools with no strings attached. That's HB 2119. And HB 2068 extends the tax credit scholarship program to make all schools eligible, and it also adds students who would be eligible. And that one has very little strings attached because it allows for Kansas non-accredited schools to receive these funds, and the only requirement that Kansas non-accredited private schools have to meet is registration with KSDE online registration. They are not subject to the same standards as Kansas accredited public and Kansas accredited private schools, and I will not be supporting this amendment.
Representative Hoy, were you referring to HB 2019 unaccredited or House Bill 2068 as unaccredited?
So the HB 2068 that would be added into 2119. That's my understanding of this amendment. That allows for Kansas accredited and then national and regional accreditation, and those are not subject to the same standards as state accredited private schools. And then 2119, no strings attached. They do not have to, they just have to provide a name and address. So combining those together, I believe, is not keeping track of our students and providing taxpayer dollars with little to no strings attached.
All right, thank you, Representative Hoy. I will add to that this state board does approve those national or regional accreditation programs, so they do have to go through the state board for approval.
Follow up on that, Madam Chair. They do have to go through, they have to be approved and they have to register online, but then after that, they are not subject to the same requirements as the Kansas accredited private schools.
Okay, thank you. Representative Byers?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two questions. One, if we're rolling 2068 into 2119, does that mean that a student would be qualified, well, if they're qualified, would be eligible for the $8,000 scholarship and state-based aid?
No.
Okay, because I'm not sure how we would merge those two together. I'm sure there's a way. And the second question is have we ever come up with a definition for what hybrid model of instruction actually means? Since school districts were able to select and choose how they did hybrid, again, we would have the problem that we could have two children live next door to each other, one parent who opted for their children to go to a school who's in hybrid mode, but who would be there in class every day, and the other a parent who sat down and said, I'd rather my children stay home, and they could be involved in that hybrid model as well.
I think, right, I don't believe that that's involved in the amendment that we're on right now. Isn't that in 2068?
Representative, that is
apologize.
not in House Bill
It's in
2068.
2119,
However,
my
it
apologies.
is in House Bill 2019. So it's a relevant question. The hybrid model is defined on page 2 of House Bill 2119. And so as many times when we put a definition in statute, there's room for some interpretation. So it could be that you are meeting one day in person, it could mean 2 days. As long as you're not in person for 5 days a week, then you could be a hybrid. So if any time you're doing some remote, not physically at the building, I think that would encompass that definition. Representative Landwehr.
Madam Chair, we're currently on
House Bill
an amendment.
Yes.
Not on 2068.
We are.
Yeah,
You are
so
correct.
We could have.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I get confused when we start amending bills in it, so.
Any other discussion on amending House Bill 2068 into House Bill 2119? All right, you may close, Representative Landwehr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, we've had a lot of discussion on that, and I, understand where Representative Hoy is coming from. What I did get from Craig Newswander was that, at the time the statute was written, the language did apply to KSDE, and there may have been some tweaks in that since we originally passed the accreditation that was recommended by KSDE. So that may be creating some confusion, and they're still trying to kind of sort that out. We had to go back to Eddie Pinner, who was on staff in this when we did all of that, and that was kind of his recollection. The idea behind this is, I don't have a problem with accreditation. And I know that some of the schools that are not under, quote, the state accreditation, but one of the others followed the law as it was written. So I close.
All right, thank you, Representative. All those in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
And those opposed, no.
No.
All right, the motion carries with the ayes, and House Bill 2068 is inside. Please let Roger know, and he'll be happy to record your votes. All right, Representative Penn, you have the floor. We're back on the House Bill 2119.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I was trying to confirm that.
I turned the numbers,
Okay. No. Blame the freshmen. Okay, Madam Chair, I have an amendment, please.
All right, you may proceed.
Okay, thank you. Now that we're on 2119, House Bill 2119, Madam Chair, I'd like to introduce an amendment that removes the remote and hybrid learning qualifying language that we have in the bill. If we could get the revisor to,
I think Roger may have that amendment. Roger,
Roger.
can you pass out the amendment removing remote and hybrid? And do you have another amendment as well?
I do. If I can go ahead and do two at the same time, please, thank you. Roger, if you also have my other amendment where we are changing that date of establishment, the start date, I'd appreciate that as well.
And there, Roger, those are the balloon amendments. So.
And with these balloon amendments, as you see them when Roger passes them out, Madam Chair, there's a little bit of strike language that we have on page 2. The committee will see that down about the quarter of the way on the page, and page 3.
All right, while he is passing that amendment out, do we have a second before we go into explanation? Representative Hoffman seconds the motion. We'll help you remember that, Roger. While he's passing out, you can give a little overview. We can come back to Nick if we need further explanation.
Very well, Madam Chair. What we, in the spirit of understanding that we had some really good discussion on this as we went through this entire bill process, we understood in there that there was some difficulty in the language, and I would just move that we strike out the portion that was pertaining to hybrid and remote learning qualifiers.
We have a motion, a second, and now is discussion. Committee. Representative Penn, then the remaining qualifiers would be at risk only and not remote and hybrid, is that correct?
That is correct. I believe that the spirit of the bill is still sustained, and I ask that all the members would hopefully support this amendment.
Representative Hoy.
Is this is reflected in both of these handouts that we got?
Representative Hoy, if you would just pick up the one that says removing remote and hybrid and set the other one aside, then he can do that one separately. Any questions about striking the language for remote and hybrid learners? Yes, Representative Nguyen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What is the rationale, please?
So, Madam Ranking, there was concern about remote and hybrid learning as a qualifier in the original language of the bill. So as we heard some of the testimony coming in from a number of the conferees, we got together and we decided that this might be a good time to strike that language out and redesignate those particular subsections and clean up the bill and just make sure that this is done the right way.
Sure.
Could you refresh my memory on some of those concerns?
I would refer you to the YouTube video. There was a number of concerns that were brought up about the language of it pertaining to remote learners, hybrid learners, private schools, and public schools.
You can't be more specific.
Well, I'm going to interrupt here for a minute, if you don't mind, Representative Penn. I think that the motion here was made because it's a compromise in a sense that there are many different qualifiers for an at-risk student that will qualify for the education savings account. And one of those at-risk qualifiers in many members of this committee's thinking was the fact that they were remote. That we had an entire informational hearing on remote learners. We also had Topeka come in and share their experiences with remote. We've had others that have shared through testimony their experiences with remote learning. And so the idea of compromising in that, for many of us, we believe that that puts kids at a disadvantage. that puts kids at risk when they're remote. However, for the simplicity of the bill, removing hybrid as a eligibility, removing hybrid as an eligibility, and just focusing on those things that we already in statute recognize as at risk. That is what this bill is doing, is just without, it's just cleaning it up and simplifying. We could probably make this list longer of qualifiers, but we collectively thought, let's make it shorter and just focus on the most at need. Yes, you are welcome. Representative Byers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question might be for Nick. I'm looking at page 3 and line 6, where it says qualified private school means any accredited private school and any non-accredited private school. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. That's part of the underlying bill. That's not part of the amendment.
Right. So, Representative, on those items, the only thing that you want to focus on, those are changes, or those are things that we have done in the underlying bill, but just for the amendment purpose, focus on the things that are in the balloon portion, and that will identify to you the changes from what we passed out of the committee. Representative Hoy.
I think I had the most recent version of 2119 that we did, that came out of this committee, and that line isn't struck in it. This says registered with the State Board of Education on page 3, lines 1 through 4. That seems to be a part of this amendment.
Nick, can you clarify on that? Is that particular part that's struck out on lines 7, 8, and 9 on page 3?
Yes, give me a sec. So the version of the bill that I'm looking at, and that this balloon is amending, and the version of the bill that I believe was inserted or that was being worked was the House Bill 2119 as amended by this committee. And as that bill shows, that was an amendment done by the committee in the first time that this bill was worked.
Representative Landwehr.
I think what we're facing here is, if I understood Nick correctly, the amendment is drafted on the version that we amended. So that may be, Representative Hoy, why you have a different version. You have the original version, and we're on version 2.
Yes, okay, so I did have Roger pass out the newest version. You probably marked up the old one.
Well, I had the old one here. I thought this was the new one.
Here's how you'll know. It'll say as amended.
Oh, yep. Thank you.
Okay, does that answer your question? Other questions for Representative Penn? All right, you may close on your First Amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I close.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. And opposed? No. Okay, all in favor, and the motion carries. Representative Penn, you can go on to your Second Amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Second Amendment is the second page that you have the start date. Up in the top right corner, you see the start date for the account establishment on July 1st, 2022.
Would you like to provide an explanation?
Let me defer to Nick on that one right there, if that's all right, Madam Chair.
Sure, and do we have a second before we proceed? Representative Landwehr? Nick?
Certainly, Madam Chair. So committee, Madam Chair, I wanted to notify the committee that I'm also emailing these to Roger so that he can, if he's got his computer there, he can email out these amendments as the committee works them.
Thank you. We do have some remote, so that would be great.
to the listserv, just so that they're out there. So I'm sending this one right now. Okay. So what this amendment would do, committee, is, as Representative Penn said, it would establish basically a new start date. Certain sections of the bill would still be effective on July 1. You would, when you're looking at this amendment on page 2, you would disregard those strikeouts that are occurring on page 2, since the prior amendment has already stricken the remote and hybrid language. So those strikeouts are already gone, and you would read this in conjunction with the prior amendment. So in new section 4, if you look at that on page 3, the account is established, but the treasurer is going to not establish student empowerment accounts until on and after July 1, 2022. And then going on to page 4, 5, 6, many of those sections are not going to take effect until July 1 of 2022. The main section that will take effect in this amendment on July 1, 2021 will be the requirement that the treasurer adopt rules and regulations necessary to carry out the provisions of this act. And those rules and regulations would be due on or before January 1 of 2022. So the treasurer would be adopting rules and regulations, and then the bulk of the sections in the account establishment and eligibility determinations would all become effective after the treasurer adopts regulations, and the program essentially would begin in July 1 of 2022.
Okay, questions for Representative Penn? We have a motion and a second, and now we're on discussion. All right, so it looks like the implementation date is the only date that changes, but the other prerequisite items that the treasurer could do would continue forthcoming if this were to pass. Representative Penn, you may close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to carry the amendment. I ask that everyone support it so that as we do this and clean up, not only do we do it, but we do it correctly. Thank you so much.
All right, all those in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. And those opposed, no. All right, the motion carries 8-1. Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairwoman, sorry.
Good.
I'd like to move that we insert the governor's budget recommendation for the Kansas Department of Education for fiscal years 2022 and fiscal year 2023, except the extension of the high-density at-risk weighting sunset from House Bill 2396 and House Bill 2397, and recommend that the House Committee on Appropriations strike the corresponding section in House Bill 2396 and House Bill 2397.
All right, there's a motion and a second by Representative Landwehr, and now on to discussion. Now, for clarification on the high density, I will note that this does not remove it from 2022. It actually sunsets, and so it doesn't address the 2023 at this time on that particular item. Yes, Representative
May I please have the motion restated?
Yeah, basically, I am taking the budget recommendations of the governor for fiscal year 2022 and 2023 and moving them into this bill.
The rest, please. You said some bill numbers.
Oh, okay. Except the extension of the high-density at-risk weighting sunset from House Bill 2396 and 2397, and recommend the House Committee Appropriations strike the corresponding section, House Bill 2396 and 2397, which is, those two are our budget bills. Those are the two main, one's the supplemental, one's the mega bill.
Representative Owsley.
This is a question maybe for Nick. Thank you, Madam Chair. Don't we have a two-subject rule?
There is a constitutional requirement for a single subject that applies, as long as all the provisions relate to education. We've had a number of bills in the past decade or so now that have been education bills that have made appropriations regarding the Department of Education and also done substantive changes. Many of those have been tied or related to the Gannon litigation.
So they've wound up in litigation when we've mixed policy and appropriations in the past. Is that correct?
That many of those, that was not the subject of the litigation. I don't remember the exact arguments, if that was argued by the plaintiffs or not. There was a single subject challenge, I believe, in 2013, a 2013 bill. I think that was making appropriations, and then also that's where teacher due process changed. And so the court did look at that under a single subject analysis and ruled that all the provisions of the bill related to education, and there wasn't a single subject issue in that bill.
Thank you, Nick. I guess I would caution the committee that while we're still under jurisdiction from the Supreme Court with the Gannon decision, that this could quite possibly be costly. Thank you, Madam Chair.
This will not interfere with the Gannon decision. We are not changing the amount of appropriations given to education. In fact, we are following and implementing the Gannon decision plan. So we are including the full governor's recommendation. We have not gotten to 2023, therefore we'll handle the high density at that time. That is it. 22 is fully funded.
Can you remind me the fiscal note of 2068 and
Yes, I sure can.
2119?
It's $5.786 billion. So that has a state general fund amount of $4.19 billion. And you can find that from the Department of Education budget documents that we reviewed a couple days in this committee. We have Representative Estes, and then we have Representative Landwehr.
I think Nick answered my question. You were saying that some of the bills that remedied Gannon were a combination of bills or a combination of ideas.
I should probably clarify. I think the question was directed at the motion to include appropriations into the bill, and I'm sure Representative Owsley will let me know if I'm incorrect on this. And I was speaking specifically to prior bills that had included appropriations and substantive changes to law, as long as they relate to education and the provisions all contain a single subject of education. There's a single subject there.
Thank you.
A couple of years ago, we passed an education bill, and it actually had the funding as well as some accountability items, pretty unique accountability items. So I wanted to provide that information for those that might not have been here. Representative Landwehr.
Nick, I think if we were to go back, the final decision that came down on Gannon was actually based on a bill that was done similar like this with the policy and the funding in it together. Isn't that correct?
Yes, like I said, many of those Gannon, the Gannon response pieces of legislation included both funding pieces and substantive policy pieces.
So it would pretty much appear, and probably an assumption, of course we know what assume does to all of us sometimes, that the court declared that constitutional, and they'd have to be going back on their original Gannon decision if this was challenged and ruled unconstitutional. I'm not asking for you to make an opinion for the Supremes. You can't do that. But I think that would be, if you were attorney talking, that would probably be the case, correct?
Certainly there's some precedent there that you're referring to some precedent that's there. As I said, I don't know. I don't remember that being argued in Gannon, but But there was a case, as I said, I believe 2013 bill might have, I'm trying to think of the bill number and I should know, that single subject issue was specifically argued with a bill that contained, I believe, appropriations and substantive policy pieces, and it was ruled constitutional.
Okay, good questions. Other questions for the carrier of the amendment? The carrier of the appropriations of $5.78 billion, Representative Nguyen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just not per se, but before we vote, you will go back and identify what is in this motion, correct?
The motion's been read a couple times. We can read it again, but it is the full contents of the governor's appropriations.
Total.
Oh, yes, we can do that. All right, if there are no other questions about the appropriations, Representative Hoffman, you may close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I close my amendment.
All right, all those in favor, say aye. And those opposed, say no. Okay, motion carries. It looks like there's those that would like to have their vote recorded. All right, Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess in regards to the budget wording that was just added, I'd like to insert a few items here. Hold on. Recommend adding language directing the Kansas State Department of Education to expend at least $5 million to fund school safety and security grants and, excuse me, $3,924,160 to expand the mental health intervention team pilot program. Add $100,000 for communities and schools, all from the Federal Emergency and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, received under Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, and for other federal law or any other federal law that appropriates money to the state for aid for coronavirus relief, if identified as able to be used for such purposes for fiscal year 2022. Second, recommend adding language directing the Kansas State Board of Education to expend monies from monies received under the Federal Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, Federal Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, or any other federal law that appropriates money to the state for aid for coronavirus relief to implement Phase 3 of the Language Assessment Program in the Kansas State School for the Deaf, or if those funds may not be used to implement such a program, to expend monies from other existing resources for fiscal year 2022. And third, recommend adding language allowing the Kansas State Department of Education to distribute monies from the local school district contribution checkoff fund not tied to current school districts to all Kansas school districts for fiscal year 2022.
Is there a second? Representative Penn. Discussion, Representative Hoy.
Would you repeat the last one, please? I just didn't get it. The last one you said, please.
Recommend, Madam Chair, recommend adding language allowing the Kansas State Department of Education to distribute monies from the local school district contribution checkoff fund that are not tied to the current school district and distribute those to all Kansas school districts for fiscal year 2022.
And just for clarification on that particular item, it was an item that was requested by the Department of Education in their enhancement request. It was on page 6 of their testimony. They had several items that they listed, and that is one of them. It happens to be the third one listed on that page. So we have a motion and second, so we're open for discussion. Questions for Representative Tarwater relating to the enhancements and or how those might be funded? No questions?
Madam Chair, I would like a minute if you wouldn't mind. These seem like big additions to the budget, and I'm just now seeing it, and I'd like just a minute to pull up that the testimony and see what this is.
Sure, and while you're looking for it, I can just share with you right now and read from it. The local school district contribution checkoff fund, this is when Craig told us a little bit about that there were some monies left over. Monies, let's see, donated funds in addition to their income tax liability. The programs require taxpayers to enter the number of the unified school district on their income tax forms. Sometimes they did not indicate a school district, and so they're not able to allocate those resources. That amount is $14,236.11. So KSDE believes it does not have the authority to distribute these monies to school districts based on this language, and they are asking us to give them the authority to distribute these monies to our Kansas school districts. Representative Estes.
Thank you. You helped me remember what this was. And if I remember correctly, that money would be doing no good if it's not redistributed. It's just kind of like in its own unclaimed property jail with no system to get out.
That's right, with no home to go to. Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just point out that these programs are all, none of these programs are new. They have been funded in the past by within this budget. The governor just did not renew them in her budget this year. And this amendment would simply say that the department needs to look at the many millions of dollars that came in through the CARES funding, the ESSER funding, the ESSER 2 funding, and the funding that is just about getting ready to be passed probably in next week out of the federal government. They need to look at those monies to fund these programs. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, and with the 15 different qualifiers for the ESSER funds, just to note that within those, mental health is definitely one that would impacted many of our kids during the coronavirus. Safety and security of our buildings, the enhancements that are going on in our buildings, that would also be a qualifier. And the last item is just something that the department wanted. Representative Hoy, did you have a question? No? Other questions for yes, Representative Byers.
So just for clarification, when we start talking about the ESSER funds, those are simply temporary monies. They're great for one-time purchases, but they're going to expire. And are we setting up districts then to be financially responsible in the future for something that we may not have the funding for?
And I think that's a great question, but one thing I would say about that is that if you look at what we're using it for, the Safe and Secures Act has to be renewed annually. The grants are new every single year. So when the governor cut that from the budget, there were no schools lined up. They have to actually apply every year with something new that they want to use to secure safety in their building. So if a future legislature chose not to appropriate funds for it, or if the governor chose not to appropriate funds, which she did, then it would be up to the body to decide if they wanted to add that $5 million back in, or if they did not. In terms of the mental health funding, if you recall, the governor allotted some money out of the mental health program. I think initially it was just over $1 million, and Representative Landwehr may have to help me with that. And then in addition to that, she cut an additional $3.9 million. She fully funded those schools that were part of the program, but they had hoped to expand. Due to the coronavirus, a lot of schools didn't put forth an application, and therefore those dollars were cut. So I guess the long answer to, or the short answer to my long reply is that every legislature has an opportunity to increase or decrease funding for any program at any time. Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I have a process question on this. Since the ESSER funds, we've created a task force or committee to review those, and it's not like we're going to just get one amount. It's school districts are going to have to request to draw down. So how are we budgeting these larger items in here and making that assumption that we're going to have dollars to draw down to spend on them when they are so specific of what they can be used for.
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that question. One of the things that we noticed in appropriations this year and in past years, in 2009 when Governor Sebelius was here, that oftentimes we use federal dollars and they get supplanted and used in our budget. We can give you an example of Governor Kelly supplanting $25 million into the Department of Corrections, and that was for salaries and wages for prisons, employees of prisons. We've also seen it in transportation where federal dollars have been supplanted. We looked very carefully at what dollars in education could be used for education purposes. So we're not taking them and spending them elsewhere. We're taking them and spending them for things that we think are high priority. Also note that it's less than $10 million out of $550 million, and that the Department of Education gets to choose how those dollars are drawn down. So they could choose to use it out of the large ESSER II pot that would go directly to the school districts and say, these are benefits to your schools, and so we're going to take it out of that pot of money. Or they could choose to take it out of their administration portion, or the portion that was directed to them, which I think was around 36 million plus some administration costs. So that's all it's all their option. Also to note that if the $1.9 trillion bill passes Congress, which it looks like it will, the school districts will get potentially 3 times this amount of money. That's $1.5 billion. And so we felt like these are very, very valuable programs and worth us including them. Yes, Representative Hoy.
Thank you. A follow-up to that, I understand that the GEAR funding and CRF funding have been used in that way, and that for corrections, that was a specific allowable expense for public safety employees. But where have we certified that we can use this ESSER funding in state general funds? That is not my understanding.
Okay, well, actually, we were provided a list when Craig was here, I believe, or I think Norma provided us a list of the 15 usable expenses that there's a lot of flexibility in that. But if you don't have that ESSER II funding list handy, or you don't have, then I'm going to defer to Norma, and she can speak specifically to these items. And yeah, go ahead, Norma.
Certainly, Madam Chair. So yeah, there were 15 allowable purposes. Originally, it was 12 under the CARES Act, and it was expanded under CRISA to include 3 additional purposes, although federal guidance has noted that those 3 purposes would have also been allowable with the CARES Act. I provided that in a memo previously to the committee, and I can provide that information again. It's all detailed out in the federal legislation. Mental health is explicitly providing mental health services and supports is a permissible use of the ESSER funding. And there are a number of other uses, and so the safety and security grants, there are broad allowable uses, other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation of and continuity of services in local educational agencies, and continuing to employ existing staff of the local education agency, for example. It's a fairly broad description of how that money can be used. And so it is our understanding that the ESSER funding can be used for those. There are, of course, yes, the 2 pots of money. So there's the money going to the school districts, that's at 90%, and then of course the 10% that remains with the Department of Education for state-specific needs. And I will note that the recommendation does clarify if the money can't be used for that, then it won't be used for that. But it's our understanding that they'd fall well within the permissible uses. And I don't know if that's our understanding of those uses.
Norma, I actually have the document in front of me. It looks like this is one of them. I think that Norma provided an updated one as well, but I'm going to read one in particular because it'll help you on the safe and secure. It said school facility repairs and improvements to enable operations of schools to reduce risk of virus transmission and exposure to environmental health hazards and to support student health needs. So a safe building in ways even beyond just the virus. And then it gives a lot of more detail on the ventilation, other items that it could also use. And then there's more on, I believe, there is one on mental health, but I'm not tracking it at the moment. Any other questions, committee? I'm going to go to Representative Owsley, and I'll come back to you, Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if I may ask a question of Craig Newenswander, if he agrees with the opinion that these do indeed fall in line with the 15 items listed.
Craig, are you with us?
I am with you. Thank you, Madam Chair, Representative. The mental health is specifically mentioned as one of the 15 items that there might be some implementation issues to just give districts money and say use it for mental health. You have to be able to verify that the need is related directly to COVID, which I think could be done, but you would need to go through some steps to do that. School safety, there is an issue or an item, let me get it in front of me, I'm sorry, that states developing and implementing procedures and systems to improve the preparedness and response efforts of local educational agencies. I think I would want a little more guidance from the federal department before I said, yes, that's what this means. But that would be the closest language I would find anyway. And then community and schools, similar with mental health, I think you would need to provide the evidence, and I think it exists, that would help kids who have fallen behind due to COVID. So again, kind of a long answer to say mostly I believe, yes, it could be used for that purpose, but we would need, I feel like we would need direction first from the federal level that as a state agency, we could direct the funds to that use.
Thank you for that response. And then do we know if the State Board of Education has already allocated their discretionary funds? Is that questions for anybody that could answer it?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Have the discretionary funds been allocated by the State Board of Education yet? Do we know?
The state board took action at their February meeting with the ESSER 2 set aside funds to direct a portion to bring the minimum amount to each district up to $300 per student, a portion to go to the Kansas State School for the Deaf and School for the Blind, and the remainder to be allocated over a 2-year time period for special education services. So yes, they did take action to allocate the funds that way.
So are the funds even there? Are they even available?
I'm not sure how to answer that. The funds have not been drawn down or distributed, but the state board did take action to indicate that that is the way it will be distributed.
Okay, then I guess that raises a question. I wonder, thank you, Craig, if this body has the authority to make that decision.
And I would note in the amendment that Representative Tarwater provided, it does not necessarily have to come out of that pot of money. It can come out of any of the CARES, any of the ESSER 2. It can be the large pot, the small pot. It is up to their discretion to determine how to best find that $9 million worth of funds. Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm still a bit hung up on the implementation of that, though, because I think we've heard a good case that this mental health funding is going to be allowed in here. But the issue is this is a pilot program. This funding's for 3 years, and the school boards will be approaching us for how they want to use these funds. And are we able to mandate how they use these ESSER funds as they come for the drawdown. I don't think that if they're choosing not to, we've heard a lot aren't participating in this program. So how are we budgeting this money that they're not, that they're coming to us to ask if this is, because this is how they want to spend it?
Well, I think that's why it's in an amendment, and it's brought before this committee to make that determination. And Representative Tarwater is the carrier of the amendment. He might have something specific he'd like to say about it, but ultimately, it's up to each of you to determine whether or not that's a reasonable request.
Well, but it's up to me, and then we have access to staff and people who are studying this and putting together these programs, and so I'd really appreciate somebody weighing in. If we don't know this, I'd like to clear it up, because it seems very irresponsible to put in this funding, and if we don't even know if we're able to distribute it to the school districts in this manner.
Representative Hoy, we've given you the information that we have. We've brought Craig into the discussion to talk about how those funds could be used. We have heard that the monies that the state board has indicated that they would like to use have not been deployed at this time. The state is responsible for the funding of education for K through 12. And so as in years past, especially in 2009, I was not here, but Governor Sebelius did put federal funds in the education budget and did fill it that way and did keep it whole at that time with federal dollars. If she had not done so, there would have been a loss, a reduction. And so she chose to do that. So whether or not it's the right moment or right time or procedure, anything that this body chooses to do, I think we can accomplish and do it within the confines of what our ability is. Representative Hoy.
But this is when we're talking broadly about putting federal dollars in here. Like I understand that component of it, but this is with very specific standards and implementation processes. When we did the Tiger grants back in the Great Recession, those had to be very well vetted. And this is, I'm sorry, I'm going down off of state budgeting. This was county budgeting, but this is the same line of very specific ways that these funds can be used. And I am not hearing that's what I'm not hearing that we can mandate that they use these funds for that pilot program.
Representative Hoy, I would encourage you to follow your conscience and vote no on this amendment. Representative Landwehr.
Well, and you make a good point, Representative Hoy, and I think what having dealt with the budget process for a lot of years up here on approps, is that there's many times that we will allocate money, and in our federal dollars, if they come back later through an audit and determine that it wasn't eligible, then we have to pay it back. And that's not an unusual move in the appropriations process.
All right. Thank you, Representative. Are there other questions for the carrier of the amendment? I believe the carrier of the amendment was Representative Tarwater. If there are no further questions, Representative Tarwater, will you close?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks everyone for the discussion in depth. So I would like to remind the committee that these are items that are not currently in the budget. There was some concern that maybe if we did this, it's temporary dollars or whatever. This is keeping these programs alive, basically. And these are very important programs. I have no idea why the governor would have cut them. But to fund school safety and security, it wasn't that long ago that was a huge concern. Just because no one's been killed in a school lately doesn't make it not important. Just keeps it from happening. Next, the mental health is we talk about most up here. A highly successful communities and schools program that this will help. And the language assessment program for the school of the deaf. I mean, come on. I close.
All right. All those in favor of the Tarwater amendment, say aye. Aye. And those opposed, no. No. Okay. The motion carries, and we'll move on to the next amendment. Representative Hubert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to make the motion to amend the contents of House Bill 2067 into House Bill 2119.
Do we have a second? Representative Penn, and Roger has 2067 for anybody that wants a refresher of 2067. Representative Hubert, would you like to explain your amendment?
Can do that.
Or you can defer to Nick.
Again, say that again.
You're good.
Okay. 2067 talks about the things that Gannon calls out as far as how we appropriate monies to the schools, and then how the schools need to be doing need assessments at the building level in order for the schools to document that they are preparing their budgets, the ability for schools to be able to meet the ROSE capacities, and also to meet, especially in the area of the 25% that the Supreme Court has called out, that are the ones that are falling behind and not having the needs met. And so this requires the school districts to prepare those budgets in a way that they're showing they're reasonably calculated to meet the needs of those students. And this is probably going to be one of the more straightforward amendments that we discussed today. So, but I would stand for questions, and if Nick needed to get more background, he could do that also.
All right, thank you, Representative Hubert. Questions for the carrier of the amendment? Any questions? All right, you get to close.
I told you this one was going to be an easy one. So, Madam Chairman, I do close.
All right, committee. All those in favor of adding House Bill 2067, say aye. And those opposed, no. All right, the motion carries. 2067 will be added into HB 2119. All right, moving on. Representative Thomas.
Yes, Madam Chair, I would like to move that we insert the language reauthorizing the 20 mil property tax levy as established by KSA 72-5142 for fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023.
Second by Representative Johnson. Okay. Questions for the carrier of the amendment? And do we have this language available if anybody needs it? But you might read it one more time.
The motion one more time?
Yes.
Yeah. The motion is to insert the language reauthorizing the 20 mil property tax levy as established by KSA 72-5142. Essentially, that was established for redeveloping schools and all that, and it actually was in the 19 and 20 budget and the 20 and 21 budget. What this amendment does is extend that property, that mill levy, for another 2 fiscal years.
All right, thank you. And this item is also one of the enhancement requests from the Department of Education that was found on page 6 of their testimony. And so it's just ensuring that we maintain this. Questions, committee, about the amendment?
Madam Chair, if I may, this is Nick.
Yes, please.
Representative Thomas, does your motion include an extension of the residential property exception as well, the $20,000 residential
Homestead.
exception as well?
Yes, sir.
So not changing anything in current law as it relates to the 20 mills and the homestead property tax exemption of the first $20,000. Not changing. Just accept the date. Yes. All right, committee. If there are no questions for the carry of the amendment, Representative Thomas, you may close.
I appreciate the rigorous debate on this particular amendment. Thank you. And with that, I close.
All right. All those in favor of extending the 20 mills, say aye. And those opposed, no. All right, the motion carries. Representative Estes.
Sorry, I was without a mic there. I've talked this year about the importance to me of seeing an increase in teacher salaries. So I have an amendment or recommendation, sorry, I meant to say recommendation to the budget report that we offer, that we give a $500 bonus to every teacher who has worked this fiscal year through the course of the year, and that be out of COVID or ESSER funds or another account as needed, if needed.
And the second is by Representative Tarwater. And this motion, do we have a copy of this amendment, Nick? Okay. And so what's the approximate fiscal note?
From what I can gather, it's about $18 million. Thank you for asking that question, because that is important for the committee to know. But based on the number of teachers, 500 apiece, that's where that goes. And it's intended for classroom teachers only, not administrators who teach in the classroom on occasion.
And so this would not require the schools to do it, but recommends?
Correct.
And what was your inspiration for this?
I've sat back and I've watched two different things that move me very much. One, when I see the money that comes out of the increase from Gannon, I don't see enough of it going to the classroom. And I used to be a classroom teacher. There's other people in here who've been classroom teachers. And this has been probably the hardest year most teachers will ever have in their life. We have a committee have had very open and honest discussions that virtual's been hard on students, and it's hurt learning. But we also forget that it was really hard on teachers. Even if you were there in person or you were doing it virtual, this has been a really hard year on teachers. A lot of people retired, and I think the people who stuck around and worked extra hard deserve extra.
All right, Nick, concerning the language that we have in front of us, is there anything that we are missing? It's a recommendation for $500 grants. Would that be reported as income for the teachers in terms of income tax purposes?
Has to be.
Madam Chair, I don't know. I haven't thought about that question. I would just maybe request a little leeway for our office to draft it so that it's a recommendation, because I believe, and I'm kind of checking, I've got one of my budget attorneys here on the WebEx with us, but I believe that this is directing, the language you have is directing the payment. So I would just request leeway if the committee chooses to adopt this to
Is the carrier of the amendment and the one that Representative Tarwater, who seconded the amendment, are you okay with that technical fix?
I am.
That would make a recommendation? Okay. They give you their blessing to ensure that the language is correct, to reflect recommendation, not requirements. Representative Hoy and then Representative Penn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, this has been an unbelievable year. Teachers have worked so hard, and it does look like classroom teacher is defined as such, a teacher under contract to teach full-time. And I really feel like custodians and social workers, school nurses, I believe that a lot of educators and staff have stepped up. Food service folks were rushing to fill bags to implement very quickly the USDA program at the beginning when they didn't know, and it was an unbelievable stress on them to get those supplies. And I just want to extend, I appreciate that we are appreciating our teachers, but there is a lot more to that story, and that is not reflected in this.
Other questions for the carrier of the amendment? Representative Penn, sorry, I forgot. And then Representative Byers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the good representative from Wichita, I want to commend for bringing this resolution forward. In my district, I know in yours, as we canvassed, we've talked to a number of our folks in our neighborhoods, some of whom were teachers, and they've borne an extraordinary brunt and burden, as you've said. My question is, would you be amenable to having this non-taxable in the language as well, the $500?
I'd be happy to go with the will of the committee. Those are things, and making it larger are things that I considered, and it was just kind of how do you keep it at a manageable fiscal note? And because the representative who mentioned the custodial workers, they were very much on my heart too. My grandfather was one. Everybody has been putting their hearts in and making this possible. The only thing that restrained me was the size of the fiscal note.
Absolutely, and I understand your heart, madam, and mine is there with you as well. That is the only reason I make the suggestion, however that must be or could be done. A number of teachers were contacting me earlier in the school year to host them or sponsor them on Amazon. They had to come out of pocket to help educate our children in the throes of this. I know that a number of you have told me the same thing was happening in your districts as well. So this is tremendously awesome. Thank you so much for bringing it to us.
Okay, Representative Byers and then Representative Thomas.
So I have a comment as well as a question. First of all, I would, as a person who had been a classroom teacher for so long, having your extraordinary efforts recognized is always a good thing. I would say if there were a way for those who ended up teaching both hybrid and remote, if they could have even had more of a reward because they had to do twice as much work as those that were standing in the classroom with the kids there every day, trying to plan those for those kids that were outside their direct control. My question is this, though. If this is coming out of CARES Act money, does this fit in, Nick or Craig, with the 15 reasons that we can use those ESSERS monies? And that's one thing. And I guess the second question would be, will this have any impact with CAPERS? And how does the formula work if we do it that way through CAPERS as well?
Craig?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative. Salaries can be addressed with the ESSER funds, as with all the other expenditures, if you can show that it's related to a need created by COVID, which I believe the representative included in her motion.
Representative Byers, did that answer your question?
That answers one. The question, I guess, still comes back to if it's taxed or non-taxed, and how does it impact on CAPERS for those teachers as well?
Madam Chair, I'm not sure if you're asking my opinion, and I would qualify it by saying it would only be my opinion. A CPA would give you better advice. But I believe if you're going to make a payment to anybody that would need to run through payroll and would therefore be taxable and also subject to CAPERS, but again, that's just my opinion.
Okay, Representative Thomas and then Representative White.
You know, what we're trying to do here, and I commend you for this, Representative, thank you very much, is 2 years ago, we had a bill. It was brought to us to provide $500 per teacher per classroom for supplies. It was overwhelmingly opposed, and the response we got was, you should just give teachers raises. Now, here we are. We have the funds. We know we have the funds. We're getting these ESSER funds. And so basically, what we're now able to say to those who opposed this 2 years ago, here you are. So I think this is excellent work. I think it gives us a chance to do what we tried to do 2 years ago, and now we have the funds coming in from the feds to do it. I would like to see it be non-taxable as well, and if, Madam Chair, if it's okay with you, I would like to make a substantive motion.
We could make a substitute motion. I do want to ask Nick about whether or not that's something that's a doable provision. I mean, I know it's getting into tax law, and I don't know if it's qualifiable.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I just don't have enough experience with prior budget items like this and whether making it subject to federal or state income tax or not is included in those budget items. I just don't have enough experience to look back on any prior precedent for that. So,
Okay, I'm not sure it can be as well. So
Why don't we just, you want to withdraw?
I will not make my motion. I just want to acknowledge that this writes to me, a wrong that was 2 years old, and I'm glad we're able to right that wrong.
And I do remember that discussion, and I do remember receiving emails about that. We wanted to make sure that they had everything they needed in their classroom, but they just wanted that pay increase, which I completely understand. Representative Hoy, and then back to Representative Estes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just for clarification, this is not a pay increase. This is a one-time $500 bonus. And I would like, since this is kind of related to some of these other discussions on how the CARES Act is used, could Craig please walk through how this is going to be implemented? Are the school districts going to come to this committee and ask for these funds, and then do they have to use them this way? I really want to
Representative Hoy,
understand this.
yes. Representative Hoy, this is recommendation. So if a school district doesn't want to take the recommendation, this does not require them to take the recommendation.
Okay, so this is just saying, like, we think it'd be great if you use the funds this way?
If they want to include it on their grant sheet that they will bring to the ESSER 2 committee, which Representative Thomas is on, then they can include that.
Thank you. And then do we have a run on how much this is going to be in each school district? Like a fiscal note of this, and how much this is going to be?
We have the fiscal note that's around $18 million, because you can just take 500, multiply by 36,000 teachers. And then, for example, your own school district, just take 500, multiply by the number of teachers in your school district. Should be a really quick search on your school district website. I want to go back to Representative Estes.
I'll wait to close, thank you.
Okay, Representative Penn? Oh, no? Okay, sorry. Representative Owsley.
Can somebody, maybe Craig, remind me what the state's number of the ESSER funds were? It was 10% of the total, but I don't recall the 10% amount, and I'm curious as to what we've recommended be allocated here, how close to that 10% that we're getting.
Madam Chair, Representative, the state set-aside funds for ESSER 2 were just a little bit less than $36 million, I believe, maybe a little bit more. And forgive me, I don't have the number in front of me. The amount that the state board approved in February to bring the minimum amount for each district up to $300 per student was about $11.5 million. $150,000 was provided for the School for the Deaf and the School for the Blind, and that left a little bit less than $24 million that the board approved to be used over a 2-year time period for special education.
I guess I'm curious about the recommendations that are coming out of this committee today, between the amendments that we've heard, and I can come back to that later.
Representative Owsley, this recommendation that's provided by Representative Estes is a recommendation. It is not coming out of that pot of money. It would be coming out of the school districts, because they would be the ones determining whether or not that they wanted to follow this recommendation or not. Each school district received, whether it was $100,000 or whether it was close to $100 million. I think more, maybe more, but I think Wichita's close to 100 million. So I think this is just a little tiny piece of that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any further questions on, Representative Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. You do not know how much that would help the morale for my friends that are still teaching. I won't be able to vote on this. I'll have to abstain because I still am under contract. But I will guarantee you I've seen teachers pull out of their own pocket and give kids stuff this last year that they'll never get back. They don't care about it, but I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Johnson, for sharing that. And Roger, be sure and record his abstaining vote when the time comes. All right. Well, Representative Estes, you may close if there are no other questions for you. You may close.
I'd like to thank everybody for their attention and comments, and they're all really appreciated. And you know, as you can tell by the way this was originally written, I really wanted it to be an amendment, but you have to get real about what the numbers are at some point, and you want to include more people because there's a lot of really wonderful school staff, and I definitely think of my grandfather, and I appreciate people being willing to embrace this concept. Thank you so much.
All right, committee, all those in favor of the $500 per teacher recommendation, please say aye. And those opposed, no? And none opposed with one abstaining. All right, thank you for bringing the amendment.
Madam
All
Chair,
right.
this is Nick. Can I just clarify something?
Yes, please.
Are you, when you say recommendation, do you mean like a traditional budget recommendation or a recommendation within the amendment to do this?
Recommendation within the
Like
amendment? Yes.
the language, the proviso that will be in this bill will read that it's a recommendation for school districts to provide this bonus.
For this budget. Yes, for this budget period.
Okay, thank you.
All right, committee, I do have an amendment, and I would like Nick to go ahead and pull out the amendment. There are just two amendments, and Nick, if we can pull up the one that relates to remote learning, let's see, the hours, the 1,116 hours. And Roger, if you can pass out that one. It will begin with, I believe, Section 1, KSA 72-3115. Is that the correct one? And Nick, while he's passing that out, I'm going to ask you to walk them through that first one on the 1,116 hours.
Certainly, Madam Chair. If you give me a sec, I will get these emailed to Roger for him to send out to the committee, and then I'll explain it. Okay, sorry about that, Madam Chair. If you're ready, I'll go ahead and explain the amendment.
Yes, and Steve, if you don't have this amendment, Roger will be sending it really soon. Go ahead, Nick.
Yes, I've emailed Roger this amendment. So committee, what this amendment would do is it would amend current law. This is 72-3115 is the law that requires a certain number of school days or school term hours to be conducted in each school year. And as you see, the amendment would say that the days of the school term, if they're doing a day system, if schools are doing a day system, shall be maintained. And those days shall only include days that allow each student enrolled in a school district to physically attend school in person on a full-time basis. Same goes for the hours. If the school district is doing school term in accordance with the required hours, the school hours during which school shall be maintained only include the hours that each student enrolled in the school district can physically attend school in person on a full-time basis. So that's the first change on the first page. And then if you flip over to, and I don't know if the pages are marked on the copies that you have, to the last couple of pages, you'll see another bulk underlined section in blue. And what this amendment is doing is it is allowing the State Board of Education to authorize a school district to provide either 40 days or 240 school term hours to be conducted using remote learning. So that the state board could authorize remote learning in districts up to that time period. This application that school districts would have to submit to conduct remote learning would require certification by the school district that due to disaster, widespread or severe property damage would occur in the district caused by the disaster, or other conditions restricting the operation of schools will exist. The school would also, or the state board, excuse me, would also have to make a determination that the school district cannot reasonably adjust its schedule to comply with the requirements of this section prior to making this application decision. The state board would not be able to waive this limitation, this remote learning limitation, pursuant to the next statute that we will discuss. And then you can see the definitions there of what a disaster is. And this mirrors the language that was adopted by the legislature last year with regard to waivers. So a disaster in this context is pretty broad. It can include proclamation by the governor of a disaster emergency, a closure of schools by health officers, or any other disaster as you would normally think of it. Also, remote learning is defined, and remote learning would be any days that a student does not physically attend the attendance center that the student would otherwise attend in person on a full-time basis. The next amendment in section 2 deals with State Board of Education waivers of school term hours and days. And what this would do is it would strike the language that was inserted last year due to the COVID response. And this would go back to how the statute existed prior to, I believe, March of 2020. So the state board could waive school term hours and days. So if a school has a disaster situation and needs reduced number of days or hours in the school year, the state board could still waive it, but the board would have to show a certification that conditions resulting from widespread or severe property damage caused by the disaster occur. And you can read the definition of disaster in this section as well. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you, Nick. And there will probably be questions, so just hold tight on that. Do we have a second to the motion? Representative Hoffman has seconded the motion. And I wanted to give a little bit of context and explanation, and then we could get more technical questions back to Nick. We can also defer some of those, or refer some of those questions to Craig. I appreciate the Department of Education taking a look at this and giving us some feedback on this. Would this be implementable? And so they're, of course, welcome to comment if you have questions related to this amendment. Okay, so the crux of this amendment is that we have an expectation of 1,116 hours. And last year in 2020, we had the pandemic and schools closed, and we understand that. Then the schools started in the fall, and the majority of our students went back to school. The majority of our students were in person. There were some that did go hybrid. And then there are some schools that have still not gone back to school. And for those of us that believe that this is a detriment to education, we do not want this to be an option moving henceforth. If a student feels that the best, most practical, safest option for them is to be at home and doing their education remotely, we have a fantastic system of programs in Kansas, and they're called virtual schools, and they are operated by our school districts. Now, there are private virtual schools and there are public virtual schools. Most of our virtual schools in Kansas, operated by public schools, are open enrollment. That means I might be able to go to the Spring Hills, or I might be able to go to one that's Western Kansas, or I might have to choose, or I might choose one that's not open or based on space. So what this amendment does is say we recognize there could be an emergency. And whatever that disaster emergency is, we recognize that those school districts may want to make or submit an application to the state board and request up to 240 hours. All right, that's about a quarter of the time, a third or quarter of the time. And then they are not allowed to go beyond that. So if there was an emergency beyond that, then the next amendment will kind of address that in terms of a financial burden. But right here, this just addresses that they would have to make that up. You just got to come back to school, because it just doesn't count to do remote. So that's the majority of this. The 40 hours in there would be, let's say, if a school district had snow days and they didn't want to, they didn't calculate them, but they wanted to use them as remote. They could use those as a remote. Or if there was a gas leak, they could use that. And by the way, for school districts that have 6-hour days, then that would be 30 hours in a week. We did beyond 1 week, just to give them that flexibility in case their school day is 7 hours, or it just gives it closer to, for sure, 1 week, but in most cases, beyond 1 week. So I want to pause here and take questions. Do we get a second? Yes, we got a second. Questions from the committee for either Nick, myself, and Craig's also on. Yes, Representative Wood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is for Nick. Could you tell me where the implementation date is, please?
So if the committee puts this into the bill, this would be implemented upon, unless the committee makes a change. I assumed the bill would continue to be implemented upon publication in the statute book, which is July 1 of 21.
I'm sorry, July 1 of what, 21?
Of this year, yes.
Okay, so this would apply, Nick, for 21-22 academic year?
Yes, this would not be effective until July 1, 21. So yes, it would apply to the next academic year.
Thank you.
Other questions, committee? No questions. All right, committee. Then I will close on this amendment by saying that we all want what's best for kids. We want to make sure that there's room for emergencies, disasters, and that there are application processes available for remote learning. But long-term remote learning should not be funded the same way, nor should it have the same availability. We want to encourage schools to go back in person, and if virtual is what a family or student needs, we encourage them to do virtual. So with that, I close on my amendment, and we'll take a vote. All those in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. And those opposed, no. And okay, the motion carries. And I don't know, Roger, for those that said no, do you want to so we have a count? Roger's confused on how many voted no. Right, he just wanted to know the number. Usually we put a 9-4 or.
So.
Just voice, okay.
I was going to ask if I may, Madam
Sure.
Chair. So on that, say a member were to abstain and just not vote, then the voice vote count would be inaccurate.
Sure, I often say 9-2 or 9 to whatever that number is. So apologies.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we're going to go on to the next amendment. I do have one other. It does relate to this. Nick, and actually, Roger, can you pass that one out?
Okay, committee.
Go ahead, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you. So committee, I've also emailed this to Roger, and hopefully you can hit the listserv with it as well. So committee, what this amendment would do, it would begin commencing in the 2021-22 school year. This amendment would basically say that remotely enrolled student would get remote enrollment state aid. So the way this would be determined is a student would be a remotely enrolled student if that student participates in remote learning for more than 240 school term hours during a state of disaster emergency, or if a student participates for more than a total of 40 school term hours if no state of disaster emergency has been declared. So if one of those qualifiers is met, if that full-time student, that full-time remote student hits those hours requirements, they are a remote student under this bill. And the district would then be required to determine that remote enrollment in the district and certify that to the State Board of Education. The State Board would be required to determine all districts' remote enrollment and adjust districts' enrollment accordingly. And those students would be funded at an amount equal to the amount of a full-time virtual student, which is $5,000. The State Board would be required to notify school districts of any amount of overpayment that was made for that student in the current school year, and either require the district to remit payment or to deduct excess amounts paid to the district from future payments becoming due to the district. The remotely enrolled students determined by this section would not be included in the adjusted enrollment, so they would not receive weightings. This would be a flat $5,000 for a remotely enrolled student. That's mainly the new section 1 of the bill. There are other amendments made to exclude from enrollment the definition of a remote student that's provided in section 1. This is under the Kansas School Equity and Enhancement Act. There's a definition of what remote enrollment is. Also, one final thing, if a student is part-time, determined to be a part-time student, so on September 20th, if they're part-time remote and part-time in the school, that student would be funded still under the Kansas School Equity Enhancement Act based upon their FTEs in the school, but they would not receive this remote enrollment state aid for their remote enrollment. And Madam Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, before we take questions, do I have a second? Representative Thomas is second the motion, and questions for Nick or for myself. Representative Wynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nick, what page would address the student who is, I see the, excuse me, September 20th as the, I'll just say, day, attendance day. Where is the explanation then if at midterm the student gets sick and has to go to remote? If they're counted as an in-person on September 20th, and then let's say, unless it's a military school, you don't have that second count day. Let's say February 1.
So yeah, this remote enrollment section 1 is more of a rolling count. So it's looking at whether a student is enrolled remotely for a certain period of time during the school year. So that 240 school term hours under a disaster declaration, or 40 school term hours if there's not a disaster declaration. So if that student continues through the school year to hit one of those hours requirements, the state board would be required to adjust the enrollment of the district and fund that student for the remote enrollment and not the regular enrollment.
So is it the responsibility of the district to report that student? Where is that identified? Who reports the student no longer in person?
So on number 4, June 30 of each year, so the end of the school year, and it could occur earlier than June 30 if the state board wishes, the school district would be required to determine their remote enrollment for that year, and then certify that amount to the state board. And the state board would examine the reports, and if they find any errors or need to make any adjustments, they would do so. And then the state board would calculate that remote enrollment and the funding.
I'm sorry I missed you. What page is that on?
That's the first page. In subsection C there, that provides the kind of the certification process, the determination process that would be made to determine remote enrollment students.
So it's kind of an audit of the previous attendance records? Is that what you're saying?
I kind of said it as maybe it's kind of a rolling enrollment determination. So you're looking back at your remote enrollment in that year.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would 40 school term hours be, is that like 6 or 7 days of school, like school days?
Approximately, some schools will go 6 hours a day, some, it may be a little bit longer.
Okay, so we're saying, should schools want to send iPads home if they know a big ice storm is coming and we're going to be maybe out of school for a few days? I don't think this is consecutive. So we're saying we don't want school districts to be able to offer remote learning for snow days.
They can do remote learning if they want to do remote learning for school days. They have 40 hours, that's over a week, and that's more than they would have had a year ago before remote learning existed. Or they can choose to just take a few snow days, which they have always done in the past. Other questions? Representative Ousley.
Just on that topic, they would have canceled school all of last week just due to temperature, not necessarily due to the snow, but it was cold enough you couldn't have a kid out at the bus stop. So I think maybe in Kansas, only having 6 days is perhaps not at the parents' wishes, you know. But I guess my question's for Nick. So if a district does not have a virtual program and a student has to change to one, who does? Then what happens to the money?
So this doesn't require a student to transfer to a virtual program. What it's doing is instead saying, if you hit those hours thresholds as a student, the district will be funded at a virtual school level, as if you were a full-time virtual student.
Even if the school district doesn't have a virtual program?
Yes, this does not doesn't impact virtual schools at all, or establish this remote enrollment as virtual school. This is just a kind of a new enrollment calculation that's being made.
I get it. I'm trying to make sense of that the school would now be funded at a virtual rate when they don't even have a virtual program.
Representative, I think what you may not be considering is they may not have a virtual program, but by allowing a student to go remote, they now have a remote program. And what this bill does is it says any student that goes beyond 240 hours, they would receive the allocation as if they were virtual. Virtual doesn't require a school building. They receive $5,000. Fantastic virtual programs in Kansas. But if a school wants to maintain student enrollment and go remote, then they too would receive that same type of funding. It's an equalizer of what is provided. The student is not prohibited from staying in the school district and going remote.
Let me think on that a minute.
And I want to talk just a quick comment about the weather. Most schools do have snow days or inclement weather days that they factor in. And everybody will have a different story last week, but in my hometown school district, my kids they didn't even have school at all. They actually got a couple snow days and they loved it. And so just a side note that this doesn't really change how we've done inclement weather days before. except it gives them an opportunity to use 5 or 6 or 7 or half days even, for remote, which is great. It actually gives more flexibility than we've previously had. Any other questions, committee? Representative Byers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I may have watched one too many disaster movies. When we're looking at worst case scenario that we have the next variation of COVID comes through and it shuts down Wichita and it shuts down Kansas City and it shuts down Shawnee, shuts down all across the state, we're looking at several school districts exceeding the cap on the number of days and then their funding coming down to the $5,000 flat fund. Are we going to have trouble meeting that maintenance of effort agreement for the ESSER 2 funds? I guess I'm asking Craig. Is that a possibility?
Madam Chair, Representative, given the scenario of another pandemic after what we've seen this year, I don't know that I would ever say nothing is, that something is not a possibility. Yes, that would be a possibility. I would not try to guess how likely the possibility would be.
Appreciate that answer. If we were to actually meet that threshold, would we have to then be responsible for taking ESSER 2 money and putting it back with the feds because we're not meeting their maintenance of effort? Or is that just sunsetted because we've done it so far that means we've qualified?
Potentially, yes, but I would not offer a solid opinion on that.
Thank you.
And definitely we could get into a lot of potential hypotheticals, but the bottom line is that we know we're all here in this building together, 165 of us, and we've had success. And we know school district after school district of all sizes have had success. And what this amendment is saying is that beyond 240 weeks per year is a reasonable amount of time to figure out how to get your kids back together for in-person learning. You can make it up. So Representative Byers, for example, if you were going to exceed this time period and the district felt it was unsafe, they could say, okay, we're gonna take our summer right now. And they could contract with their employees to say that they have the ability during a pandemic to put their contract on hold. And they could say, we're going to take our summer break right now. We're going to come back, but they're going to finish the school year. So this actually takes us back to where we were last year before the coronavirus. It acknowledges a tornado. It acknowledges property damage. Those school districts are still able to waive those types of emergencies. And when I say waive, I mean completely waive. The State Board of Education could say, you don't have to make up those last 100 days, or whatever it is. 100 would be quite a bit. But whatever number of days or hours, they could do that. This is only addressing the changes that we made last year and amending those changes that we made last year, but putting some parameters around the hours that could be used so that remote learning can be henceforth incorporated in times of disaster emergency. And that could even include something that was local, something, a flu outbreak in your community. Representative Wynn.
And I think you just misspoke yourself. You said 240 weeks.
Well, if I said 240 weeks, then yes, it's 240 hours. Oh, sure, I misspeak probably every day. No, I think everybody understands. It's in print, it's 240 hours. Representative Estes.
So this gives the district a lot of flexibility and puts the needs of the child first, because they can now have a tool to rearrange the calendar that they didn't have before.
Correct. They can delay school, they can go remotely, but they do need to make that application to the state board. And the state board's there to give them guidance and assistance as they have, but it's just putting tighter parameters on it. And from many of the schools that many of us have visited, They want that. There are reasons that some are in school and some are not, and it's not always the choice of the superintendent or even the board. Sometimes they feel other types of pressures, and we're putting some requirements that we think are reasonable and safe. Thank you for the question. Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And back to the enrollment, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So the child misses however many educational hours, and then the school district is required to switch to virtual enrollment for that student. Isn't enrollment deadline September 20th?
That's the first count date, but as was shared by Nick, there's going to be adjustments made. And so we actually talked to the Department of Education. We went through how that process would be done, and the simplest way to do would be making an adjustment on that. So in all likelihood, this will never, just not going to happen. But if it does happen and a school wants to make or have a child go, or a student wants to go remote, or if a student wants to go virtual, they still can go virtual at semester. In most situations, they can choose a virtual program. This does not prohibit that. This just says the funding, if you do go remote after 240 hours, you have that ability, but it is going to receive the same amount that you would get for virtual because you're not in the school building.
Okay, so back to the weather then, say the student doesn't want to go virtual, but they exceed that threshold, and the school district is still required to switch that pupil or that student's enrollment weighting to the virtual weighting?
It is the school district's prerogative. It is, they are to be in person. They have 1,116 hours. That has not changed. They are given 240 hours so that they can go remote. And if a school district wants to provide leniencies that allow them to go remote, they can. If they do not, they're not required to allow remote learning. They can require in-person learning. Most would say, well, we have virtual programs. Let me help you get into a virtual program. If they don't want to do that, they can put them into a remote. Either way, that student, if they were virtual, they would receive $5,000. If they're remote, they're going to receive $5,000. It is a similar education, but I would probably argue not as good when you're not in a virtual program that's very systematic, that you don't have to wait on, you're not logging in and off, waiting for a teacher that may or may not show up. So but they're both remote. They're both, one's virtual, one's remote, but they do the same thing. They do not require you to be in the building. And this is saying it will be funded the same way. If you don't need the building, we're not going to pay you for the building.
So I guess I would offer that, weather is not the school district's prerogative. And if you have the ability to do remote learning instead of canceling school and perhaps adding days on at the end of the school year to make up for those days, when you do have the option to go remote, that if a school district were to make that option and send those iPads home with those kids for that extended period of time that breaks the threshold in this amendment, and then they return to school as normal, they would now be forced to either cancel school those days or switch enrollment to virtual.
Well, that's an interesting question, because what this bill does is it makes it better than it was last year before March. Because last year before March, you could not have gone remote if you had had a cold week. You would have had to take that week off, and you would have had to make those days up in May if you didn't calculate those days. There's a certain number of hours or days, depending on how they're applied in your district. This is no different. Now, if we lived in Wisconsin or Minnesota, we might want to make that 80 additional hours, but the 240 disaster hours, or 40 hours for really any reason that may present itself that's within the confines of this bill, can be applied. So I think it's very generous in that sense. And as mentioned before, if it happened prior to March of 2020 and school districts didn't have days built in, they would have just extended their school year. They would have said, okay, you guys stay home, it's bad weather, we don't have snow days, doesn't matter, stay safe, we'll tack those days on at the end of the year. We want kids to have their education, and this allows for them to have their education in person with some leniencies for the remote as well. Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't disagree with the intent to take a look at this pandemic. We need to take a look at it at every level and do massive case studies and take a look at our response, because it is possible something like this could happen again. And what the problem that I have with this particular solution is that I don't know that it's been vetted. I don't know that school districts have weighed in on this. I really feel like a alternative solution would be to bring people together once we get on the other side of this and say, what were the little bits and pieces that worked? What was terrible? We've heard from everyone. I can't wait for my son to walk through the doors of his school again. But this, I just can't vote yes on this. I think we need to do more. I think it needs to be people weighing in on this, and to say, yeah, right now it's easy to say, I never want to do 40 hours of that again, because I don't. But the reality is that this did happen. It is something that can happen, and let's be prepared for it next time.
Andrew, I think it will still go to the audio. It may stop the... All right, committee, we had a slight interruption. If you don't have the YouTube feed, then I would encourage you to go to the ks.legislature.org and go just to the audio feed that's in the top right-hand corner of the website, so that you, of course, if you're on the YouTube, you're not going to know I just said that, so never mind. Okay, other questions? I don't know who we left off. Representative Pitt.
Madam Chair, thank you. Just a quick question. Does this violate or conflict at all with the KEMA bill that we passed earlier? It still allows for all of those emergencies and all of the things that we've already put in the statute?
Well, I know that they're working on it today and then maybe finishing it tomorrow, but I don't think that there would be any reason that it would. But we can definitely ask. Nick, your thoughts on that?
So I don't know all the statutes that are being amended in the KEMA bill, but if two statutes are amended in different ways during the same section, we will call that a conflict, and we'll reconcile those conflicts in a reconciliation bill at the end of the year.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that instruction. I appreciate that education. Madam Chair, because this amendment offers maximum flexibility to our school districts to do the things that are necessary and proper to educate our children, which is what we've been listening to, both the educators, the students, the parents, as well as the administrators tell us in this committee, I fully support this amendment, and I encourage everyone to do the same. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, committee. Well, thank you for your patience. Again, this amendment is to address the remote learning, address how that might be paid and funded, and hopefully it'll be something that will not be relevant to our schools, that our kids will be back in school. That's everyone's hope. So with that, I close on my amendment, and we'll take a vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. And those opposed, no. And the motion carries. Are there any other amendments? All right, then Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I would, as I make, Nick, I'm not exactly sure how to make this ending, but I would move that we pass out House Bill 2119 as a substitute bill for House Bill 2119 as, well, not as amended then, I guess it'd just be a substitute bill. Is that the way I say it?
Okay, hold one moment. Nick, you can explain how he wants to put it in a substitute bill. Representative Owsley, did you have a question?
So we're back on the bill?
Well, we were back on the bill once we closed that amendment. I asked if there were any other amendments, or I opened it up. Did you?
Is there time for discussion?
Sure.
Okay, because I
That's probably just, I apologize, that's how I say it. Any other amendments?
my other chairs always ask, you know, we're back.
I'm
on the
not
bill.
your every other chair, apologies. We all a little bit different.
That's obvious. So do we know how many bills now have been bundled into 2119?
3 bills.
Well, we had 2068, and then I thought the budget bill referenced 2 other bills also, or the budget amendment. There's 4 bills in there. Do we know how many of those have had hearings?
Well, all of those, we passed out 2119, we passed out 2068, we had a hearing on Senate Bill 61, we passed out 2067, we passed out on the floor last year the portion that deals with the hours that we amended out. The budget, we have dealt with the budget on 2 different days in here, so that's a lot.
I didn't know the budget. I thought the budget hearings were informational. I didn't realize they were.
You're well, I mean, when we have a budget hearing, it's discussion too. I mean, people ask questions.
Okay. I don't know. This is mixing appropriations. This is mixing policy. I know that, you know, it's been covered, but I'm not comfortable with it. It seems to me like we're adding a whole lot of policy and a whole lot of budget without a whole lot of public input or chance to input. I think we could possibly be out of compliance with federal guidelines, and I never sat on appropriations, so that gives me caution, and it maybe just be a lack of experience from being on appropriations. We never did hear from the treasurer's office. This does involve the treasurer's office. It seemed like they ought to have some input on it, and seems to adjust a financial formula without any real discussion on that. And then it's built on the foundation of what I believe to be bad policy, and I've voted against twice, so I'll be a no vote here today. Thank you.
Completely understandable. We did have a treasurer's, I think the treasurer actually did an op-ed piece in the Wichita Eagle on it, and then we had a fiscal note on a portion of it. So you might be able to get some more details on that. In terms of the formula, we're not touching the formula, we're not reducing anything. So there's no amendments related to that. We actually added more funding then, and we took the governor's recommendation. Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How much did we add in enhancements with the different motions, and as well then as the proviso?
I believe that the proviso language was a recommendation, so if you want to count the 18 million, it's not a requirement. So I don't think you could fully count that. The other would be less than 10 million, 9 million, something. Yeah.
I would really like to know the exact amount of what we're voting on.
Sure. It's actually you already, the 466,000 we already voted on, so we didn't put the exact language in there. Then it's we stated it, it's the 3.94 million for the mental health, and then 100,000 for the community and schools, and then 5 million for the Safe and Secures Act that was eliminated or cut from the governor's budget.
All right, so
I think this was this one of our amendments that we had. I'm not sure if Norma does have this language, so we could forward it to you if you don't have the actual.
Madam
language.
Chair, this is Norma.
Yes.
To clarify, this isn't adding additional money. This is adding language directing the Department of Education on the spending of federal funds, which they are already expected to receive or have received or may receive. So it's any federal funding received dealing with the coronavirus response.
Thank you for that clarification. I thought we were the 3.9, 400,000 and 5, I thought those were being added and suggested as line items. I did understand that for the teacher salary. So they're similar. We're treating those similarly as just recommending that these go in. They're not specifically being added as line items to the budget. Okay.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Norma.
To clarify, my understanding is those programs, it is adding language directing the Department of Education to spend that money, rather than the salary bonus is more of a recommendation that the school districts should consider spending that money. So there is a slight difference. My understanding is the Department of Education will spend money for the mental health program, the school safety and security grants, and the communities and schools, with the only exception being if the federal funds, if that's an impermissible use of the federal funds, whereas the teacher salary was a recommendation that school districts consider spending ESSER funding for those salary increases.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have concerns about the implementation of the ESSER funding. I have concerns about the impact that combining some of this policy in there could have on the MOE as we move these on. We're also using one-time funds. We're also suggesting the use of one-time funds for a pilot program that I think would be really good to have like as an actual program. And I do want to reiterate that these are not, those were not cuts. Those were suggested enhancements. And I really am struggling on voting no on this, but as it all is coupled in there, piled, not even coupled, piled in here together, I haven't had enough to digest all this, and I do not feel comfortable supporting this now, and I know we'll see it again, and hopefully as it goes through the process, it'll be improved.
All right, thank you, Representative. And actually, in terms of the mental health pilot program, it's not just that it's 3.9 million. There's over, I think, approximately 12 million. It's a higher number than this. And the governor did make an allotment initially, and then she made an additional cut. So she did take from the total of the program. Any other, I don't want to miss anyone. Representative Nguyen.
And thank you, Madam Chair. And you did say before we voted you would itemize everything that's in this bill.
My apologies. Are there any other questions? And I will do that. Thank you for reminding me. Representative Byers.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So going back to the base bill of 2119, and our original discussion about this, we talked about the fact that the weighted funding would remain with the school districts. Now with this current amendment we've put into here, if a school district gets into a position where the students are being flat funded for virtual school, how does that impact what the school district would receive if that student were to take advantage of the savings accounts?
Okay, they're not related other than the fact that if they have a student that goes remote beyond 240 hours, they're going to get $5,000. That's it. There's no other connection between 2119 and the qualifications there versus the other. I do not think that many school districts are going to opt to allow students to go remote for $5,000. I think they would encourage them likely to go into a virtual program.
And just for more clarification on that, so as far as the qualifying for that student who would then be able to go into that, if they were to go into that and they're only getting state-based aid, so does the district then get the remainder of that $5,000 not included in state-based aid?
If the school district was, if that student was full-time and they weren't remote, then the district would receive that, yes. Because the remote students, and Nick can expand on this, correct me, whatever needs to be, or clarify what I'm just now saying, is the language that Nick drew up initially that's in the bill or in the amendment says that that's how you, on September 20th, if you go beyond, you can't count them as a remote learner. If you're a remote learner, you're going to get $5,000. If you go over the 240 hours. So I'm going to let Nick take a stab at it because I might be confusing your question.
Yeah, so remote learners are looking at the total time in the school year that they are participating in full-time remote days. There's a provision in there that says that remote learners who are participating remotely for half a day for part-time would not be getting that remote funding. Instead, they would be calculated as their FTE in the school as it's normally calculated. So if they're not hitting that remote threshold, they're not going to be included as a remote student, and they're just going to be calculated based on their FTE that they're in the school.
Representative Byers, I would also add that the school district has that choice. They don't have to allow someone to go remote. If a child wants to only go half-time to that school district and that parent wants them to only go half-time, then that school district gets that amount of money for that half-time in person. They will continue to be paid for their in-person, depending on, are they going half-time, a portion of that time, they will get that. They do not get the portion for remote. And so a school district could say, if you choose to go half-time, we will do that, but we don't offer a remote program. It's up to them.
Thank you for that clarification.
Other questions? Representative Nguyen.
And I'm just a bit confused, but if a student is on September 20th, a virtual student, and goes to the private school, the virtual funding.
A virtual student, I don't know if we mentioned that in this bill. We talked about public schools. I don't know if 2119 touched on the virtual piece of that. Nick, can you respond to that question?
So virtual funding is determined also based on a count date or count dates. Full-time virtual student gets $5,000. Part-time virtual students, it's a reduced amount. And there's a provision that if you're part-time virtual and part-time in the school, your funding is based on both of those part-time amounts, both the part-time virtual and then whatever your FTEs are in the school building. But it doesn't discuss anything about private schools. Virtual, if you were enrolled in a private school as well as a virtual school and receiving virtual school state aid, you'd be part-time virtual, I believe.
And if a student is enrolled in a virtual school and they qualified, let's say they were low income, they had a free lunch, then that school district's not going to get a base state aid percentage because they didn't receive a base state aid percentage to begin with.
I was worried about how much does the private school get?
The private school is going to get the base state aid amount, which is less than the virtual school amount. The base state aid amount is around $4,600 right now.
Right, I understand that. And virtual is the 5,000.
Yes, they won't get the 5.
They'll get the base state aid.
Yes.
Only.
Yes, but to Nick's point, I don't know that that's explicitly laid out in the bill. That might be a Department of Education rules to implement. Nick can respond to that.
I might have, Representative Nguyen, were you talking about the education savings accounts piece?
Potentially have both education 20 and 2068.
So the education savings accounts piece is based on the base state aid per pupil, that base state aid amount. There's no links to virtual funding whatsoever in that education savings account piece.
So a virtual student would not qualify.
And also, yeah, no, virtual students do not get weighted under the formula. I would have to inquire with Craig if they're still, I don't know, if they're still determined to be at risk in any way or anything along those lines, but I don't believe so.
Well, just Madam Chair, the scenario of full-time going to private school, virtual going to private school, the parent deciding to whatever, how do these all mix up? We don't know.
Right. If a if a virtual student wanted to go and utilize this program, I'm not sure if there's a pathway in this bill that actually provides for that. So they might not be a qualifier for it. If they did, if they did qualify for it, then that $5,000, that would not, the ESA would only get the base state aid. They would get the base state aid. They don't get the $5,000 for their ESA. So we would have to see if there's a pathway, but we did not, to Nick's point, and Craig can comment on it, we don't have at-risk students for virtual students, but maybe Craig can enlighten us.
Madam Chair, that's correct. Weightings do not apply for virtual students.
And this bill was specifically for at-risk students that are identified in their public school. So if you're not identified, if there's no waiting for you, then I don't think that a virtual student would qualify for 2119.
No, they wouldn't.
Okay. So we did not incorporate virtual schools into 2119. But thank you for the question, because that's a good question. Any other comments or questions from the committee? All right, thank you for your patience. And Representative Hoffman.
It's all right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to go through.
Whoops. Hold on. Let me go through the list. All right, so committee, here is what we have in our bill, House Bill 2119, that Representative Hoffman will close up here in just a moment. We amended House Bill 2119 with the items that Representative Penn included, and those two items included changing the date, the implementation date to 2022, and it also included removing the remote learners, removing the hybrid learners from that at-risk group. The next item that we did was the Hoffman amendments, and Hoffman amendments included provisions from the governor's budget. We accepted her recommendations, and with those recommendations of $5.7 billion, we did incorporate the tar water amendment, which was what we just discussed with the Safe and Secures Act of $5 million, the mental health pilot program for 3.9, and the $100,000 for community and schools that would be used through some type of federal funds, and it would be up to the Department of Education to decide what those funds would be in order to fulfill that. We also had an amendment from Representative Landwehr, which was 2068, and that's the tax credit bill that we heard. We included House Bill 2067, that was the Hubert Amendment, and that relates to how you certify your budget from the classroom up. We had Representative Thomas's amendment that extended the 20 mills and the homestead. We had Representative Estes's amendment that would recommend schools provide a $500 gift stipend to teachers, or a grant. And I think, and then lastly, my amendment to provide for the provisions of the 1,116 hours less the 240 for remote learning. And I think I said that one, 67. And then also providing that remote learners would be the same or equivalent to the virtual in funding if they exceeded the 240 hours per academic school year. Oh, well, yes, and the School for the Deaf money is something that we passed out of our committee, but yes, it is included in this budget again. And that is the $466,658, and the language that we passed out of this committee stays with that, and that has already been provided to the Department of Education, and they have been directed to use their funds, and they are actually, to date, still looking at where best to put those funds. And I did receive an email from Representative, or she used to be a Representative, Melissa Rooker, and they're looking at ways to integrate that now. So I think that's the list. And actually, Norma, would you be able to, maybe put that list together for us and send it to Roger? If not, yes?
Certainly.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Now, Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Third time's a charm, maybe. All right. I move that a Senate or a House substitute bill for House Bill 2119 be created, and we pass it out favorable.
All right. The second still stands with the original motion. Is that right? Nick, is that motion clear enough, concise enough to put it in a House bill and close it out all in one? It's good? All right, perfect. All right, committee, thank you for your work today. All those in favor, say aye. And those opposed, no. All right, committee, the substitute Sub-House Bill 2119 passes out favorably from our K-12 Budget Committee. Thank you all for your good work, and I hope you have a great evening. We are officially adjourned, and Representative Hoy can get a drink of water.